G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. Today, one of the most popular progressive political commentators and talk show hosts in the world. He is an online phenomenon, David Pakman. He has over 1.8 million subscribers on YouTube. He dominates in the area in which I'm about to embark, online media rather than conventional broadcast media. He started the David Pakman Show in 2005, and by 2011 it had been picked up by conventional media outlets, by cable news channels and local affiliates and so on. And he's gone from strength to strength. He's appeared on Fox News and CNN and Joe Rogan's show as a kind of a voice for a younger generation of progressives who perhaps aren't so obsessed with culture war issues. Now, I sat down with David earlier this year, I would say 3 months ago. It was before the October 7th attack in Israel by Hamas. I suppose, in hindsight, we would have spoken about that if we were speaking today, and specifically about what that has done to American politics, the divisions that it's opened up over those who are siding with Palestinians, over those who are siding with Israelis. But in some ways, I'm glad that we're not speaking now. I'm glad that we have something of a minor time capsule to the way that we were feeling about the state of the American mood and of American political division prior to October 7th. That tragedy and the ongoing tragedy in Gaza has a tendency to suck up all the oxygen in the room. And there is a certain opportunity cost in that, an opportunity cost of the things that we could be talking about that we are not. So forgive the fact that we don't talk about this and we seem like we're completely oblivious to the events of the past 2 months. But nonetheless, it's a really, really useful snapshot and insight into the way that American politics is currently cleaving itself in the absence of the Israel-Gaza issue. David thinks that the left is more reasonable than I do, so we get into that and butt heads a little bit. I hope you enjoy the one and only, the legend, David Pakman. So you were just saying that you want to move to Spain. And I was saying, when I was last on your show in October of 2017, first year of Donald Trump, everyone was saying, before he was elected, we're all going to move to Canada if he's elected. And you know what? Saskatchewan is still empty. It's still only bears. And so I'm calling your bluff on moving to Spain, Dave.
No, and this has nothing to do with Trump. Like, I'm not even pretending that it has to. For me, it's more, I'm from Argentina. And so my options are, okay, I'm a U.S. citizen. I can always go back to Argentina, but the economy's not so good and there's a lot of complicated things going on. I could go to Israel, but it would take a couple years to get citizenship. And I don't know that I'm necessarily looking to leave forever. It's more just that the U.S. is sort of organized in a much more antisocial way than a lot of Mediterranean Europe and South America. And I like a lot of aspects of that lifestyle, people hanging out at cafes at all hours of the day, and you don't have to hide your children away starting at 7 p.m. I have a little baby daughter now, and people are out, they're in society,
It's so funny you say that. I was literally just doing talkback on my radio show, David, about what time people eat dinner. Because Australia, much like America, I imagine, has this weird disjoint where you've got the old school Anglo-Saxon tradition of having dinner at 5:30 or 6. I'm sure there are swathes of the Midwest where people come home and they have dinner at 6 p.m. And then you've got the people who live a more Mediterranean lifestyle who eat at 9 or 10. And the hostility and argumentation between those two sides, both of whom think have perfected the right way to live, is hilarious. But I'm with you. Who wouldn't like a Mediterranean lifestyle? One of my best buddies used to live in Berlin. He was an English guy. And he came to visit in Sydney, and Sydney has with the exception of the late night thing, it has quite a Mediterranean feel. It's a harbour city. People are quite hedonistic. People are friendly and laid back. They like their coffee. They like their food. And he was like, yeah, but I like the grittiness of Berlin. I like the harshness and the culture. I like the cold, and I like the seriousness. I like the import of Berlin. And then when the global financial crisis happened, he was sent to Athens to report on the Greek meltdown and the Greek no vote. He's never returned. He's never returned to Berlin. Of course, once you get a taste for the Mediterranean lifestyle, now he lives in Rome. He's like, Viva Roma! Who doesn't want this, baby? He's getting around on his Vespa over cobblestone streets and smoking and drinking until the wee hours of the morning. It's the best.
I do think the thing that would be tough if you are used to the United States, so a lot of things I think would be great, but I think the one thing that could be tough is the bureaucracy and difficulty of accomplishing what should be extraordinarily simple and mundane.
Yeah.
Paperwork, or I need to get a plumber sort of thing. This is the ubiquitous complaint from people I know who have moved to Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, which is, it took me 3 years to remodel my bathroom. It took me 6 months to renew a passport. And, you know, I do think that would become a frustration.
Don't try to start a small business. Don't think that you're going to create a tech hub or something.
Yeah.
Although I must say, you know where you need to move then? You need to move to Northern Europe.
Right. Well, I love
go to Denmark, man.
Denmark is fantastic.
Your paperwork, there is no paperwork. What paperwork? Just walk into a post office and they'll hand you a license for a new small business. You're done.
The problem with Denmark, of course, is weather a little bit, and it's a different vibe. You know, it's a little more uptight, I think, than what maybe I'm looking for.
Yeah, that's true. And also within the Anglosphere, it's funny that you say that you think of those Mediterranean countries as being infuriatingly bureaucratic and difficult to get things done, because in the Anglosphere, that's America to me. I mean, America, having lived in America for a dozen years and now living in a country that properly funds its tax office and its public services and its organs of state, it's amazing. Like, I still have to do U.S. taxes because I'm married to an American guy, and it's just nightmare. Like, you try to log into irs.gov, and it kicks you back to some other website. So I create an account with this other ETOPS website, which is a subsidiary of IRS. I get through the final process after entering my inside leg measurements and, you know, all of the data that they need, and then they say, Your new password and PIN will be mailed to you within 4 to 6 weeks. I'm in Australia. I need access now. You go to the website. You try, and you need your last year's return in order to enter something, but that never works, and it doesn't understand my address because I'm not in the like the system of working. You know, the private health insurance in America. The fucking HIPAA thing, you need to fax everything everywhere. Like this, it is the most advanced developing country in the world, or the least developed country. You know, here in Australia, it's not perfect, but you know, like the state government has an app that's pretty good, and you just log on and things work. You can renew your license without waiting in line for 8 hours. So you can do even better.
It's all relative. And I've had no shortage of frustrations with bureaucracy in the United States. And then I heard about what my friend who bought an apartment in France was going through. And I said, okay, some things don't work that poorly here, I guess I must say.
That's true.
Yeah.
How's the political conversation? How's the climate? Tell me that I'm wrong in viewing from afar my beloved former homeland gradually disintegrating into a basket of quarreling tribes.
No, I agree. I mean, listen, at this point, it's extremely en vogue to make one of a few assessments of what's going on. And so you've got the tribalism people who love to rant for an hour about we've become so tribalistic, and that's really fundamentally the problem. And then you have the next layer, which is, wait, hold on a second. Sure, tribalism, fine. But one side is objectively crazy. So it's not just tribalism. You quite literally have one side that has abandoned policy. They're all about wokeness, even though they can't define it. They're all about an obsession with trans people and drag shows. And so it's not. So then that layer comes in. Then you have the next layer, which is we have fundamentally two countries in the United States. And I'm actually quite partial to this. So this now is not just what some say. I actually do think it's at least accurate to say, in the United States, you can divide the country up in a number of ways, geographically, politically, a bunch of different ways. It is absolutely the case that there is a basket of states in the US whose standard of living, education, infrastructure, access to healthcare, average income is like that of Norway and Denmark. You have that basket of states. You then have a different basket of states that is very much like some of the poorer countries of the world in terms of all of these metrics. And that latter basket is subsidized at the federal tax level by the first basket of states. This is a reality. When you look at, just something as simple as dental care, how common is it that you visited the dentist in the last 6 months and you see these dramatic differences from Connecticut to Mississippi, for example. And built into that is so much economics and sociology and anthropology and all these different things. And there are really a couple of countries that are living, it's not even side by side. You could say it's urban, rural. There's a number of ways to slice and dice it, but that is absolutely happening all at the same time.
Mm. Don't they also have more than two? That I've seen some demographers breaking America up into these really interesting set of countries. I can't remember, they're like 7 or something.
Yeah.
But and the point I've often made, the point to foreigners who ask me for simplistic, reductionistic explanations of what's happening in America, like after Trump was elected. Oh my goodness, Americans are so this or Americans are so that. I'm like, there is as much of a difference between Oregon and Mississippi and New Orleans and Boston as there is really between parts of Portugal and parts of Belgium, with the exception of the language. I have more in common with you and my buddy who I was just talking about who lived in Berlin and now lives in the Mediterranean. There is a cosmopolitan, rootless elite of people, as the anti-globalists like to call us, who really do have more in common with each other than the blood and soil, salt of the earth people who have a deep sense of place and tradition in often
100%.
poorer regional and rural parts of America.
Yeah, I've said before, and I've discussed, talking about the whole moving thing, the transition for me, I've spent quite a bit of time in London. I've spent quite a bit of time in Madrid. Paris is a little different because I speak English and Spanish, but my French is very mediocre. But even still, transitioning there would be far simpler than moving to Akron, Ohio for me, or something along those lines, culturally and in so many different ways. And sometimes I'll talk to people who say, oh yeah, I didn't really like the US. It's just so hot. And oh, really? Where did you go? Well, my partner was worked in Dallas, Texas for a year.
Right.
You really don't know the United States from that any more than, the French say Paris is really not reflective of all of France. You've got southern France and then Brittany, and that's a much smaller country. Imagine the United States and saying, I know what I know from being in Dallas for a year. It's obviously much more complex than that.
Yeah, totally. You mentioned earlier, by the way, before we leave that, did you know that the GDP of the United States, I don't understand how economists measure this stuff or what's going on. The GDP per capita of the United States is so much higher than other comparable countries where I regard the standard of living as being generally superior, that I read that the GDP per capita in Mississippi is higher than the UK.
Yeah, that may be. GDP per capita, median income is probably better to tell you something about quality of life than GDP per capita, because GDP per capita can be, you're just basically dividing up what is produced economically by the number of people that live there, and it can be extraordinarily unequal. So although you're dividing it by the population, the actual income or profit from that can be extremely concentrated. So it's not a great indicator of quality of life.
I'm going to look it up now. I'm just going to bore the listener. So nominal GDP at current 2022 prices. Oh, I see. Nominal GDP per capita, $47,190 in Mississippi. GDP per capita of UK, or let's say France, since you were talking about France.
Yeah.
43,000. Oh, yeah, so less. So Mississippi has a higher GDP per capita than France.
Yeah. Or to give another example, if you look at the state of Virginia, GDP per capita is 71,000, but median income is 37,000. So we're really looking at two different things.
Well, let's look at median income then. Median income Mississippi is $25,000 in 2020. Gee, that's not a lot, is it? Median income France, 28,000. 25 versus 28, man. The average median.
I'm seeing 40 for France. I'm seeing 40 for France.
Maybe Google's misleading me.
Could be. In any case.
In US dollars or in euros? The
in
Wikipedia
US
for median income has France at 28,146. Interesting indeed.
Yeah.
You were saying earlier, David, and now that's going to haunt me all day. I still don't understand. I still just don't understand it. I don't understand how you can drive through. You drive through Mississippi, and I mean, you made the comment about dentistry, but like, you look at the way people live. I mean, I guess there may be something going on here in terms of class rather than like in class comparison and culture versus just economic well-being, in the sense
certainly
that I would see a town in Mississippi that's denuded of all soul and culture and is just a large road with strip malls and a Walmart where fat people are waddling in and buying their cheap consumer electronics goods as evidence of poverty. But when I once said that to an American friend of mine, he was like, well, perversely, that's actually evidence of opulence, right? These are people who are able to buy more consumer goods than your average French person might be. So the old French guy who's like walking through a cobblestone town and going and sitting down and smoking and playing boule and drinking coffee with his friends may be actually less of a financial, he may be poorer on paper than the person who's driving a big cheap SUV to Walmart to waddle in and buy their Dunkin' Donuts. In some ways, that is a superior economic actor, the poor American, than the median Frenchman.
Yeah, and this has been explored quite a bit because of all of the discussion, particularly since Donald Trump became president, about China and tariffs on China and bringing production back home in the context of the pandemic and this sort of thing, which is that in the United States, a decision was made, not by one person, but just by a successive series of policy decisions, that we'd rather the cheap stuff from China so that people can go into the Walmart and buy the stuff, and the lower salaries and the offshoring of jobs, et cetera. And whenever politicians left or right talk about bringing production back home, sure, that could be done over a period of decades, but it also would bring with it significantly higher costs at Walmart, at places like Walmart. And it's not really clear that people like it. It seems to some degree that the whole concept here is, yes, we may not have access to good healthcare. Yes, we may not make a lot of money, but we get such cheap stuff from China that we can still get a TV or whatever the case may be. Some on the right will use this as proof that there's no poverty problem. I remember a Bill O'Reilly segment, it must be 10 years ago, but it's in my mind, where he said, listen, the poor in the US are fine. They still have big screen TVs and cell phones. And it sort of misses the bigger picture about what actually leads to satisfaction, what actually leads to freedom to self-determine how you want to live your life, or mobility, or these sorts of things. But it is true that many of the poor in the United States, factually speaking, still have a big screen TV like you're talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting. And look, I don't object to the idea that it doesn't matter if you don't have wage or salary growth as long as you have de-inflation on all of the goods that you want to buy. That is functionally like getting a wage rise. It doesn't matter if you keep earning $30,000 a year if the cost of everything that you care about is going down by 20% because we're getting more efficient and we're offshoring and and there's freer trade and there's AI or whatever. The problem is that you also need to include in that basket of things that you care about education and health.
Right.
You can't you can't have your big screen TV and then also have diabetes that isn't treated.
Yeah. And the other thing, I mean, there's a bigger economic conversation, but deflation might sound good, but it's actually not good for the economy, at least as far as we've structured it, because under deflationary circumstances, you would expect things to cost less in the future, which would cause you to delay purchases on anything you don't absolutely need. That delay of purchase starves businesses of customers, which causes them to lay people off. And so the deflationary spiral is also bad at the macroeconomic level. But at least practically speaking, you're making a good point, which is people may not feel the wage stagnation if they can continue to get cheap stuff from China.
Yeah, it's interesting. I honestly think that if the United States were able to resolve those two things, health and education, in other words, if there was healthcare, at least a baseline of healthcare for everybody, and I'd like to get your thoughts about this as well, about what that would look like, because I think many on the American left are kidding themselves if they think that what universal healthcare is extending the largesse that Americans currently enjoy from many of their best private plans to everybody. That's not what we enjoy in countries where there is quote-unquote universal healthcare, like Australia and Canada and most of Western Europe. It's much more limited. So Americans would have a bit of a shock, I think, in realizing that, oh, okay, well now there's all kinds of things that aren't covered. I mean, in Australia, dental isn't covered by the government, for example. There are all kinds of hodgepodge compromises that countries have to make to get laws passed and to get things through that don't make a lot of sense. But if you could do that, and if you could fix education so that public schools were funded equitably instead of from the local property taxes in their neighbourhood, I mean, can you think of a more bizarre way to entrench disadvantage than to fund local schools by property taxes on the local communities so that poor areas get shitty schools and rich ones get rich ones, you know?
And there's a little bit of redistribution that happens at the state level where states will also supplement funding. And so that's one area where the taxes from a rich area may go to slightly improve schools in less wealthy areas, but it's a fraction of the total funding as you're pointing out.
Yeah, I mean, and so if you fix public school funding, if you control the cost of tertiary education, or at least make the assumption that you're going to have a university degree less of an assumption and invest more in technical skills or whatever else you need to do to make it less mandatory to enter the adult workforce with a six-figure debt and provide healthcare, then I think America looks pretty good.
Right, and those are pretty significant changes. On the college thing, it is interesting. You know, I have a 15-month-old daughter now, and I'm going through the motions of she's absolutely going to college, but I don't really believe that she's absolutely going to college. You know, I'm doing what we call a 529 plan. It's sort of like a college savings account with some tax advantages, and I'm doing all of this stuff. But when I sit back and think, okay, if she went to the school I went to, and there's I think it's 6% a year cost growth we've seen over the last 20 years. If that continues, it'll be about $200,000 per year by the time she's 18. Okay, so $800,000 for a 4-year degree. It just doesn't make any sense.
No, but
it just makes no sense. It makes no sense in any way.
You have one thing going for you, which is you're also a foreign national, and I hear there are universities in Buenos Aires.
Yes, and they're free.
Yeah. Exactly. You know, the Australian government introduced. I was paying attention to the whole debate about whether, you know, the Biden college loan thing, whether or not college loans should be forgiven, whether or not there should be free university education. And I got to say, as something of a centrist myself, I'm moderately sympathetic to the sense of injustice that some people feel who have paid off their loans. Like, why do these people get a free handout? And I did the right thing. They didn't pay it off. I managed to pay it off. Also, the sense that should universities be completely, you know, funded by state universities? This is in the United States. Of course, Harvard degrees aren't going to be fully federally funded, but should state colleges be funded fully from the taxpayer with no co-pay from the people who go there? Well, university graduates tend to earn more than other people, so what you're basically doing is requiring people with lower incomes who are paying taxes to subsidize people who go on to have higher incomes with university degrees. Australia came up with a pretty good solution in the 1980s, which has been gradually whittled away by successive conservative governments and undermined. But it was good at the time, which was called the Higher Education Contribution Scheme, where the government, you wouldn't need to put any money down to go to university up front. You still don't. The government gives you a loan. That loan is an interest-free loan, although it's pegged to inflation, so it rises according to the Consumer Price Index every year, but you're never going to be saddled with paying interest. The government issues the loan itself, and you only need to start paying back the loan after your income hits like above roughly average income. Now that threshold has come down and down over the years, and it's sort of at poverty level now. But the idea was, and it's collected by the tax office without you having to worry about it or see it.
Right.
So when you get your tax statement at the end of the year from the Australian equivalent of the IRS, here are your taxes. You've hit the threshold to pay back your higher education contribution scheme. Here's a sliding scale. You start at 2%, 4%, and you go up to 6%. And ultimately, then once you've paid it off, then you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to think about it. It solves the problem of inequality because although there is a discount for people who pay in full up front, and although there are still some fees, when I went to university, the government covered 80% of it at least, and I had to pay about 20% of it.
So that does exist in the United States for federal loans, and Joe Biden recently expanded the income-based repayment so that more people will qualify. It's sort of just like growing the pool of people that can take advantage of that. So it exists to a degree. It's not good for everybody, particularly folks who are earning enough to not qualify, but still not so much that repaying the loan right away is comfortable. But that does exist a little bit. By the way, I don't want to forget this.
For poor people?
I'm sorry?
Do you mean it only exists for poor people in the States?
It's expanded a little bit. The problem, I guess what I'm saying is there are folks who are making too much to qualify, but still not really
but in Australia,
that much.
It's universal and it's available for millions.
Yeah.
Anyway, you said you didn't want to forget something.
It continues to tickle me that in the UK and Australia, calling something a scheme doesn't mean that it's bad. Oh. I always love that. In the US, we say, oh, they've come up with this scheme. You're not going to believe it. And you're basically talking about like a scam.
Right.
And I know that that's not what
a cabal has come up with a scheme.
With the
David.
scheme, exactly. Yeah.
No,
I think you're absolutely right on all of those things. I also think that if this collapses, so when we think like, will my daughter really pay $800,000 for a bachelor's degree? I don't know. It's not sounding really good to me. It also will advantage folks who have other paths to make connections in society. And in my mind, with the people that I know, I could help my daughter not go to college and get the right internships and help her start a business where she may be less affected by this outrageous increase to the cost of a 4-year degree. That may not be an option for other people. So it, again, is just another way in which it will probably grow inequality.
And yet, even within the university sector, the fact that there are legacy admissions, which I only learned about this year, I didn't know this was still a thing. That you could, that your child has an obvious, overt, unabashed, unashamed, unhidden, formal leg up in getting into the institution that you went to. That is the definition of inequality, of inherited generational inequality right there. Just get rid of that, like for a start. I mean, when you're talking about, race-based admissions, or should we be able to take this into account, or should we be able to take that into account? How about daddy was privileged enough to go here is something we get rid of.
Now, I don't know that every institution has that I just don't know enough about it. Yeah, right.
Yeah, well, the Yales.
I just don't know that state schools have legacy admissions. Maybe they do. I'm just not sure.
No, but maybe you don't need them in state schools. I mean, we're talking about the 1% or the 5%, I guess. You said earlier, just to pivot back to culture war stuff, that there's this whole narrative that some people go on about we're so tribalized, we can't speak to each other anymore, we're quarreling, and the problem with that analysis is that there is one side that's gone batshit crazy. I would concur with all of that. But I would also add, isn't it worth interrogating why one side has gone batshit crazy? Not to absolve them of any responsibility for doing so, but they haven't dropped from the sky. And sometimes I feel that the left, progressives or social justice activists or whatever you want to call them, are providing a tremendous amount of ammunition that can be cynically misused by people who want to rile up the right, and they are nudging it further off the cliff. Is that blaming the victim?
Well, I think it would be interesting to hear some examples of the ammunition you're referring to.
So I suppose the censoriousness of the way that people have conversations on social media, the censoriousness of the way that academic institutions handle flare-ups on social media, the the hysteria and censoriousness that university students, including graduate students, can exhibit towards different ideas that they regard as being hate speech. So there are a million examples one could give, but the most recent one that I've heard is it Yoel Inbar, who does the, I don't know if you know he has a podcast, Two Psychologists, anyway.
Rings a bell.
The basic story. He's a center left guy. He's not a manipulative, like, oh, I'm so heterodox, like bro. And his wife was offered a job at UCLA. He's an academic, and he went through the whole process. Was apparently going to get the job, and then graduate students dug up podcasts that he'd done years ago in which he was skeptical about diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and processes, not because he's anti-diversity. He's very pro-diversity. He has bona fides of being pro-equality and pro-diversity. But the kind of bureaucratic, formulaic, form-filling, checkbox-ticking way that white university-educated people can formalize the structures of appropriate DEI work was bothering him. And in fact, I mean, one of the concerns that he had was if you're a new migrant from South Asia, you may just not be in the loop of all of the ways that we're supposed to talk about race in America, and the way that the things that you're supposed to say in the essay that you need to write to demonstrate how your academic career is going to benefit minorities and people of color and people of different genders. Like, it just may not be quite on your radar, and this may be sort of a cabal, coming back to that word, or a scheme in which white people with the correct education and the correct critical theory framework are able to promote each other and privilege each other over people who haven't got the memo on that stuff. So graduate students heard these podcasts. They presented him as being anti-diversity, racist. There was a petition. It went viral. UCLA pulled back, didn't offer him the job. We can't be 100% sure that they would have offered him the job, but everything certainly didn't help that there was this campaign against him. This is one of a million little things. I mean, you can talk about the New York Times journalist who was fired for, using the N-word in conversation amongst some students, or the other professor who was fired for talking about a Chinese word that sounds a little bit like the N-word, but that triggered people. So those are the kinds of examples, if you're asking for specifics, that are very easily cherry-picked, presented to an audience in a certain way, and don't aid the bringing together of America.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple different things there. So the Yoel Inbar situation is an interesting one. You were talking about legacy admissions. Yoel's girlfriend had been offered a position in the psychology department at UCLA, and there is a form of legacy / nepotistic admissions of hiring at universities where they have these, if your spouse gets hired and you're also a PhD, we will kind of go out of our way to create a position for you. We could debate whether that's a good policy or not.
That doesn't bother me, though, does it?
Doesn't bother you. That's fair.
It's horizontal, right? It's not
fair.
imperative.
Fair.
And also, it's a sweetener for them to say, like, I know you're moving across the country.
Yeah.
Let's make it easy.
No, but it's an interesting element to it. I'm sort of looking at the details here, and he voiced skepticism about the DEI statements at the school. He wants institutional neutrality in certain places. He apparently made some transgressions when it comes to so-called inclusive etiquette, in terms of he called a woman of color intense in a conversation with another professor. I don't really like this stuff, but in a different. So there's a couple different layers to this. One is, are these types of statements worthy of not hiring someone? That's question number one. Question number two is, should student activism around such statements be considered by an educational institution in making such hiring decisions, or should hiring decisions be made without considering the feedback of students? And of course, these students decide we're going to activate against or for something, not necessarily only on its merits, but there develops this sort of like groupthink. I would probably align with you on 99% of these things.
Is your answer to both of those questions no?
My answer is, well, let's take them one by one. In terms of should these sorts of statements preclude someone from getting a certain job? I mean, listen, I would love to say that it should have no impact whatsoever, but I think the problem is, where do you draw the line? I don't like this. What I'm reading about this particular case concerns me. I also am aware of the fact that if there is going to be a cultural mismatch, even if I feel that the culture is wrong, do I believe the institution should be in some way blocked from considering past statements? Probably not. Like,
No,
they
I don't
probably
think
should
the
be
argument
allowed.
is that institutions should be blocked from doing so. They're a private
I think maybe the
institution.
problem
They're allowed
is,
to be as silly as they want to.
yeah, I think so. I think we agree there. I don't like that this is the way that so many hiring decisions are ultimately being made, which is sort of rooting around in one's past combined with this sort of activism to say, do not bring this person here. It doesn't seem like the most sophisticated and precise way to hire.
Say that again. That would be my third point. I mean, I think you're falling short with two. Yes, there's should criticisms in the past on a podcast of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and calling a black colleague intense when she may have actually been intense preclude you from being employed? The answer to that may be no. Then the question is, should campaigns by graduate students, activist campaigns, be heeded by the academic hirers, employers? I mean, the answer to that, I think, is contingent on our answer to a third question that I would add, which is, what is the manner in which and what are the systems through which we are making decisions, one and two? In other words, Are we responding in a knee-jerk fashion to a social media mob because we're terrified that we're going to look bad and it's going to put us on the wrong side of some kind of ideological diktat? Or are we listening to what the students are saying, evaluating them rationally, and trying to assess whether or not it is in fact true that this person is either racist or bigoted or one? I mean, I don't agree with you that an ideological fit, especially at an academic institution, is grounds for not bringing somebody in. I think that you would have to demonstrate that he genuinely he does not have the interests of minority students at heart. You would have to demonstrate that there's an actual there, not just that he's quibbling with processes and systems. Otherwise, if that becomes a legitimate grounds for not hiring people or for firing people or for pillorying people in public or denigrating them or excluding them from polite society or no longer inviting them to your cocktail parties, then you really are setting up a kind of a quasi-Stalinist, or at least, let's say, McCarthyist kind of system where there's right think and there's wrong think. And if you question the systems that we have and you question the importance for our most vulnerable people in our society for you to fill out the forms in triplicate and write your essays about how you're going to assist them and pledge allegiance to the party elders and essentially say the right things, if you dare to question, to think independently, to value traditional old liberal ideas of having a wide and rambunctious public debate where all voices are accepted, doesn't mean they're right. You can criticize them, you can push back on them, but that's the whole point. You can push back on them. You're not going to be regarded as a heretic who'll be burnt at the stake or who'll lose their job for pushing back on them. Like, if your vision is not one of a liberal demos, an arena of free speech, but your worldview is, look, we only take people who agree with basically the framework that we've set up and that we all agree on. I think that opens the door to a very pernicious place. And clearly a lot of Americans do as well, because that's getting used cynically by people who feel as anxious as I do about that as a way to hoodwink them and cajole them and bully them and frighten them into voting for noxious individuals who want to undermine American democracy. So I think the stakes are a lot higher than people give it credit for, on the left give it credit for, when we start playing this game.
Yeah, I don't really have an acute problem with anything you said there, although I do think there are certainly some examples of in academic departments where the departures from some of the norms would genuinely just the entire fit thing, it's like I don't really want to debate on its merits in individual cases, because the real concern I have with this entire discussion is that in the absence of policy, the American right wing has chosen to cynically blow up the relative importance and frequency of what you and I are talking about to make it the issue. They lie about it. They exaggerate. They tell stories about accommodations, about, cat litter boxes in bathrooms for students that identify as animals. So I think this is a great conversation. And the problem I have with it, even we're doing it right now, if someone doesn't know what's going on in the US and they come in and they hear the last 15 minutes, they will almost certainly come away thinking that this sort of thing is far more central to the main problems that the country is facing right now. I don't think that it is. I think economic issues, healthcare, our lack of dealing with the climate, the fact that education is so pathetic in so many parts of the country. There are so many other issues that I think are more important. I think voters generally agree, which is why what you see on Reddit and Twitter does not always end up reflecting the way that elections go. So I think it's a perfectly fine conversation. On the specifics, you and I will mostly agree. But the problem that I see is the right has tricked people into thinking this is really what's at the foremost of the minds of the American voters, when it is not.
Yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree that it is a total sideshow to what really matters, and I'd agree with your list of those things. The climate chaos probably being maybe the most important thing, because I think it's going to have knock-on effects to so many other things. I think the cost and stress and just sheer hassle of constantly dealing with deadly wildfires and hurricanes is just going to drive everybody up the wall, and it's going to make it much harder to get anything else done. But the only thing I would add to that, or maybe push back on, is that underpinning our ability to address any of those things is the viability and sustainability of American democracy. And to the extent that these stories are getting manipulated and misused, and they're essentially being used as the laser pointer in front of the cat, or the keys jangling in front of the face of your 15-month-old, to distract voters from what really ails them, which are largely questions of economic justice and environmental justice. And to the extent that the new social justice orthodoxies on the left empower that, and I'm not talking necessarily about one-off examples of Yoel Inbar. I'm also talking about the reframing of what justice means from a conversation around economics and class to a conversations around identity, race, gender, and so on. And I think that is a real pivot that's actually happened in the past 10 years, that there is now a sense that the colorblindness of, forget about Mandela or Martin Luther King or Gandhi, even the colorblindness of someone like Obama is now seen as somewhat passé and naive, and that the real justice mission is in turning the dial up, not down, on our self-consciousness about our own identities, turning the dial up, not down, on our own sense of energized tribalism, turning the dial up, not down, on our fear that we are all scrambling for a piece of a finite pie, and that our identities are what should define how much of that pie we get. There is a change in rhetoric on the left from one of universalism and economic justice and class to one of identity. And that shift is empowering and pouring petrol on the fears that you're talking about on the right. And my concern is, again, I don't want to spend all our time banging on about how bad the left is, but if the only people who are calling out the left for the problems in that shift are cynical right-wingers, then we're going to have a problem, which is why I think it's actually worth people like me spending time trying to gently coax my colleagues on the left to be more sane, because I fear that they're holding a dance party and pouring fire onto a bonfire that nobody wants to get out of control.
I agree, and I'm on the same page as far as that goes. For years, I have said very clearly, this is not the predominant view of the left. But to the extent that identity politics has become toxic, the left needs to be saying that needs to stop. And I've said so many times, identity does matter in the sense that our identity does inform our experience and our view on things. So to the extent that I might say, hey, I'm Jewish, let me tell you about the way that anti-Semitism has manifested in my role as the host of my show, my identity is relevant to that because that's exactly what we're talking about. Now, if I start using my identity as a cudgel to silence others or to in some way structurally change what they can or should be allowed to say or the things that we're talking about, that's where the line has to be drawn. And I've said the toxic identity politics of the left do enable the right. And also, I am observing that it is an extremely small but loud portion of the left. And so one of the things that I try to do as someone from the left is not give it more oxygen than it deserves. Don't ignore it, as you're saying. I don't ignore it, but I say, oh, in addition to all these other things that I want to talk about, there is also this contingent of the left. Here's why I disagree with it. Here's why it's counterproductive. Here's why it serves right-wing interests. Let's be aware of it, but we're not going to spend, my entire show talking about that for, whatever the case may be.
I'm not sure I would concur, though, that it's small and loud. I mean, it depends what we're defining, right? I mean, so the people who will actually come out and spit in the face of a professor for, I don't know, daring to talk about equality instead of equity or something like that is small and loud. But, I mean, I don't know what world you're living in, but there are all kinds of new orthodoxies that really cannot be questioned without you being pilloried or excluded from polite society.
I just don't know that I agree. I mean, I agree that there are attempts to impose these orthodoxies. But if there's any greater example of the fact that it is not predominant in any space on the left, it's the 2020 Democratic primary, where you had one discussion that was attempted to be imposed primarily on social media. And it was a discussion about the disaster, the racist disaster that is Joe Biden, and on and on and on. And you would have looked at it and said, wow, Bernie Sanders is going to win this primary on the backs of this woke agenda of that, exactly what you're describing. And then people in Michigan and Wisconsin and South Carolina who work for a living, spend very little time on social media, spend very little time paying attention to this stuff, said, oh, I like the economic message of Joe Biden, and that's who I'm voting for.
Don't misunderstand me. I'm not talking about a majority of Democratic voters. I'm talking about a vast majority of the chattering classes. I'm talking about what we think of as being the intellectual elite. We're talking about the people who go to parties in Brooklyn and and on the east side of Los Angeles. We're not talking about people who work
I hate to say it, but
in the Midwest.
The fraction of those on the left in Los Angeles and Brooklyn who go to the parties and impose those orthodoxies is a pretty damn small part of the entire left.
I don't think that the ideas that are generated and the orthodoxies that are imposed by those people are without their harms. They filter out through the editorial pages of newspapers. They filter out through the campaigns of politicians. They filter out through what people are acceptably demonized for on social media. I mean, let's just talk specifics, rather than talking around it. Let me think of some things off the top of my head. How easy is it for a white person? In Australia, there's an obvious example, which would be that it has become the norm in the past 10 years for every meeting, including online, to begin with an acknowledgement of country, a land acknowledgement, right? It is not really tenable to say, I'm not sure that we necessarily are actually assisting any Indigenous people by us white people on this Zoom call reciting this catechism. You won't be invited back to the next Zoom call.
Yeah, so that's a really good example. Can I just weigh in on that example?
Yeah.
So I agree with you completely. I have said for years, I think those declarations and the let's go around the room or the Zoom with our pronouns, I think both of those things do not make sense. Are there some people that disagree with me? Sure. Are there some institutions that have said this is what we're doing, and if you question it, you're going to be ostracized? 100% that exists.
I mean, yeah,
I think it's such a small percentage.
No, it's not.
I really do.
Not. I mean, the biggest drug companies in America and the biggest software companies in America now have pronouns in their bios. And yeah, maybe you can opt out. I'm not sure. My friends who work for one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, which is actually headquartered in Switzerland. He works in Switzerland,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, the California social justice orthodoxy has made its way to Switzerland. He doesn't, in practice, have the right as a senior manager to remove his pronouns from his bio. It would be seen as like, why do you hate transgender people so much?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're kind of getting it to the point where we just disagree as to the relative frequency of this stuff. I don't know anyone who has even
the number of the number of top 50 companies that have pronouns in their bios, I suppose. It would be
I'd be curious to know what the numbers are. I don't know the numbers. So I mean, I think I agree with you that I think it's a bit much. And, I'm sure there are some on the left that will disagree with me. But when I've expressed these views to my audience, it's not considered controversial. And my audience is overwhelmingly on the left.
I mean, but I intentionally said that I was picking an example where Australia was much more along the path of those particular examples. But I mean, I'm just trying to think of a more Americanized example. It'd be interesting to know what kinds of polite left-wing environments you could say, I really don't believe that white people are racist. I don't think that this idea of there being like structural racism is even a thing, and I don't think that there's such a thing as inherited intergenerational trauma. I think every person is just born a new person, and there's no. You're not owed anything just because there was slavery in the past. There was slavery in all kinds of places. The Arabs had slaves. The Brits had slaves. The United States is sitting on half of Mexico. Life is tough. Everyone sort of needs to figure out how to make it on their own. I don't agree that there is any existing and living disadvantage against black people in America. I mean that I don't know how far you would get with that claim. Yeah. Those are not things that I'm saying that I believe. I'm just trying to point to things.
I think it depends on which one of those things you're saying. I think that, like, to give two examples, saying I'm not convinced there should be reparations for the descendants of slaves. Some on the left will say, "Oh, that's the wrong position to take." Others will say,
"I would not include that as something that I think has become
fair."
verboten.
On the other hand, it's pretty uncontroversial to say that, for example, in many major cities, a form of structural racism that's left over from decades past is the way that public transit is organized. Public transit remains organized in a way that makes it very difficult to get from the historically black neighborhoods to the neighborhoods where all the jobs are. It's not because anybody today said, let's make racist bus lines. It's a vestige of what there was before. And it's a form of structural racism. It doesn't mean the guy from the, transit authority is personally racist, but I think we have to also accept that those things do exist. So I think it's a much more complicated gray area with a lot of this stuff.
Do you think that there is do you think that the things that can be discussed openly without fear of being misrepresented are constrained more tightly today than they were in the past?
Probably. Yeah, probably. I mean,
For the
I think
better?
I don't think so. No. So here's my thing. My view is it should be on the table to discuss anything. None of these conversations should be blocked or preempted out of hand. And the example I often give is when I think it was the Harvard president at the time, Larry Summers, he said something about maybe there's something neurologically about men and women and math. Like maybe there is something that explains why there are more male mathematicians than female. And he was like roundly attacked for it, and it was crazy. My view on that is if it were true that there were something about the brain that made men and women different when it comes to math, we should know that. It would be extremely important to know that. It should be explored. It shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. And also, we need to be vigilant about people who are asking these questions in bad faith, sometimes questions to which we already have answers. So I hope I'm making like the two sides clear. When we say, Are you saying we shouldn't be allowed to know whether vaccines cause autism? Of course we should be allowed to know, but it's been studied, and you just saying you're not being allowed to ask the question is wrong. You're allowed to ask it. It's been studied. We have data. So I think we have to both be attuned to bad faith blocking of certain questions, but also people who want to ask questions we have the answers to, and they're doing it for cynical reasons.
That's true. I mean, I would just make the point that censorship is more insidious than just saying you can't have that conversation, right? I mean, the very few people, even the most cancel culture-y person is unlikely to say you're not allowed to have that conversation. Now, they might disinvite a speaker from coming to college or something, which is a version of that.
There will be repercussions.
But the more insidious, the repercussions are the more insidious thing. The fact that you walk around the rest of your life with a whiff about you, which you're carrying from having been the subject of a social media pile-on that was accusing you of being racist or bigoted in some way, right? I mean, it's just it's a willful misinterpretation of what you're trying to say. And on the Larry Summers question, I mean, maybe a more pressing example on that same issue was when Google fired the engineer, James Damore, who Google had literally said, let's try to figure out how to get more women into software engineering. So we're open to all suggestions, like everyone write in. We're asking all of our employees for an understanding. He writes this piece saying, there may just be gender differences here. There may be things that women are interested in. And I would add that I don't think the autism and vaccines analogy is a good one, because there we really do have science on that. I mean, we know that there is no link. The jury is still out. I mean, there are all kinds of studies that show that if you get 1,000 women together in a room and give them the option of taking apart a bunch of widgets and putting them back together, or if you ask them if they want to spend the day mediating a family dispute, and then you do the same with a bunch of men, there actually is a gender difference. Now, is that biological? Is that acculturated? We don't know. But I don't think that firing someone for saying, maybe, two sexes have been going back through biology for a very long time. Lots of different animals and lots of different cultures structure the interests of the two sexes in different ways and the roles of the two sexes in different ways. Maybe there is some kind of biological difference. This is another issue that is likely to get you pilloried and accused of bigotry towards transgender people if you insist that there's some difference between the biological sexes. But I mean, I don't think we can say that the case is closed on that question.
No, I think in some areas the case is closed, and in some it is not. Some have been studied, and some have not. I think the example you gave, obviously, that the 1,000 men and the 1,000 women are being asked to choose what they'd rather do, with decades of culture already in their brains, and so I think you and I understand why it's a sort of complicated question. The James Damore thing, I interviewed him. I have to admit, it's been a while since I remember he wrote a sort of manifesto of sorts explaining his potential views on the thing. One of the things that I remember about that was when I interviewed him, it seemed to me that he did not relate easily to other people, and it was later revealed that he's actually autistic, and I wonder to what degree the interactions with him became frayed, because he does, as a result of that, struggle in some of these conversations, and I don't know how he was communicating these things behind the scenes. There's so much to that I don't remember.
That's revealing. I mean, it's also revealing because people on the spectrum tend to have a difficulty in understanding the sort of social cues and social niceties and social norms that neurotypical people take for granted. So he may have just said, like, I'm just telling my version of the truth, and I don't understand why that's a problem.
Yeah, it's been so long that I just don't remember. But obviously I remember the story, but some of the details elude me now.
Yeah. I want to talk to you about Joe Biden and maybe the alternative media universe, the Joe Rogans and Tim Pools of the world. But for our regular listeners, I want to thank you for listening, and I want to thank you for being here. We'll wrap up that portion. If you want to subscribe to Uncomfortable Conversations, it's uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen. You get your own personalized feed with all of the premium content, including additional bonus episodes, and these final little chapters with the likes of David Pakman. David, a lot of the rhetoric that I feel is coming out of American politics at the moment that I hear is, on the left at least, an anxiety about Biden's age. Is that an unfair distraction? To hear the rest of this conversation, go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen, and you will get your own personal premium podcast feed with at least 3 extra episodes of the podcast every month and heaps of extra stuff, including the remainder right now of the fabulous conversation you've just been hearing. If it was worth listening to this much of, don't rob yourself of the rest. Pull out your phone right now and search for Uncomfortable Conversations on Substack.